I am Myroslava Znayenko, your chair for the day. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speakers. I'm happy to say that all three of them have something very important in common. They are specialists in literary and cultural policies of the Soviet Union, in addition to many other fields of interest and competence. That is Professor Olga Bertelsen, Myroslav Shkandrij, and Halyna Hryn. The first speaker will be Dr. Olga Bertelsen, who has a PhD from the University of Nottingham and is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto at the Global Affairs Center at the University of Toronto. Her research interests are quite wide, but one of the most exciting things that she does, she studies oppression and repression on the basis of research and archival materials and the application of political psychiatry and state violence, especially towards intellectuals. So it gives me great pleasure. She has, of course, several publications. The biographical data, those of you who are interested in more detail, are available there on the table. So may I first introduce Dr. Bertelsen. You better speak, tell your title because I forgot.
Sure, it's fine. Sure. Good afternoon. Can you hear me like that? The title. I don't remember my title. I have to look. I'm sorry.
I can come back.
No. Spatial dimensions of Soviet repression in the 1930s. I will talk about Budynek Slova in Kharkiv, Ukraine. And it is my great pleasure to be here today and to be a part of this wonderful conference dedicated to the memory of one of the most celebrated Ukrainian scholars, Yuri Shevelyov. And for some scholars, Shevelyov is first of all a linguist, for others a literary critic. Of course, he was both, and for me, Shevelyov was also a witness to the extermination of the whole generation of Ukrainian writers, poets, teachers, actors that occurred during the interwar period in the 1920s and the 1930s, a generation that became known as the executed Renaissance. And most of them were the residents of Budynek Slova, the House of Writers, that survived World War II and is still there in Kharkiv, in the center of the city, and it preserves its original name. We all have our personal reasons for our research. However, I believe the most important factors that determine perhaps our research agenda and professional interests are cultural space and a geographical place where we were born, where we grew up, where we fell in love, where we matured, and more specifically, there is one place for me. This is Kharkiv for me, because this is the place of my birth, and more specifically, Budynek Slova, because I was born physically there. This place is always the place which draws me. I mean, the place of my birth, because it seems to me I haven't missed a trip without going there to look at the trees that my father planted there in the internal yard of this building 50 years ago. I think the majority knows this story. In 1927, the Ukrainian intelligentsia in Kharkiv decided to build an apartment building for themselves, and this project was completed in late 1929, and in January 1930, most of them moved into this new luxurious apartments, and immediately after they moved in their new homes, the atmosphere in the building became quite dismal. the secret police began to arrest its residents one by one. And according to my calculations, approximately 87% of the residents were arrested, exiled, and executed as Ukrainian nationalists and members of various nationalist organizations. What I would like to do today, I will briefly discuss the main argument of my research. I will also briefly discuss maybe the main points of, just let me grab my water because it just too dry. The main points of my research, because I think they're very important to this particular research and to our understanding of what happened during this time in Kharkiv. And briefly, of course, I will talk about the significance of this research. My study dethrones the myth about the generous treatment of Ukraine in the 1920s during Ukrainization, and provides evidence that Ukrainian intellectuals were harassed not for their ethnicity per se, but rather for their cultural distinctiveness, cultural aspirations, and their self-identification. The language they spoke, Ukrainian, most of them, the place in which they existed, and the art they created. The study also examines the transformation of human behavior under the terror and physical torture, and demonstrates that the physical removal of the Ukrainian intelligentsia was a state operation designed to eliminate the nationally conscious and critically thinking section of Ukrainian society. The extreme form of cultural disruption was not accidental, but the result of a planned action directed against the proponents of Ukrainian cultural distinctiveness, which it was feared was leading to political separatism. And the main points, actually I will discuss, if I have time, 5 of them: specific policies and treatment of intellectuals in Ukraine. The second is the issue of subjectivity. The third, I will also briefly talk about the repression of Galicians. Also, I will talk also briefly about the multi-ethnic factor of the repression. And finally, if I have time, I will discuss people's behavior in prison under the threat of violence. And all these main points that I'm going to discuss here, I think they provoke a lot of questions. What case can we build on the basis of these main points? What explanations of the terror in Ukraine can we provide? And how can we link the place within Akslova, the House of Writers, to a bigger picture? The deaths of millions of people in the territory of Ukraine during the interwar period. First, let me talk a little bit about specific policies and treatment of intellectuals in Ukraine, in Kharkiv specifically. For my study, I chose the spatial approach, and this approach was chosen not accidentally, because I believe space and place dictate human behavior and also state policies, state practices. And for the state, Ukraine was associated with resistance and nationalism, and this factor conditioned the specific features of party attitudes toward those who supported Ukrainization, and as the archival evidence shows. Interestingly enough, the anti-peasant and anti-nationalist campaigns in Ukraine were undertaken simultaneously, and also distinct, they were related. They were both attacks on nationalism, but conducted by 2 different sub-departments of the GPO, the Soviet Secret Police. And the construction of nationalism in the GPO, in the Secret Police, was a very specific one. Every opponent or critic of the USSR was included in this construct and characterized as a Ukrainian nationalist. The UNR, the Petlurite, the KPZU, the OUN, and even some foreign governments and Russian monarchies were identified as Ukrainian nationalists. The pattern of terror in the House of Writers repeats the national patterns. Ukrainians, Russians, and Jews fell victim of Stalin's terror. From the very beginning, the meaning, the original meaning, the authentic meaning of this building was very different for both parties. For instance, for the writers, it was, of course, an intellectual space and a place in which a new Ukrainian culture had been produced. And for the state and for the secret police, the place was characterized as a nest of nationalists, and in which the writers' nationalist transgressions and misdeeds were not, so to speak, not an individual but a collective affair. Historiographically, I believe casting the Soviet government's attitudes toward Ukrainization as paternal ethnophilia, Sloskin's term, is inconsistent with the archival evidence, the practices of the Soviet state, and the massive scale of terror and violence. And by the way, also its tempo. Moreover, specific state policies in Ukraine do not allow to create one common denominator for considering the lives of the intelligentsia in Ukraine and in the Russian Federation. Also, there were, of course, some common features. I provide evidence that is contrary to Sheila Fitzpatrick's view. She has claimed that, I'm quoting, from the first half of the 1930s, the intelligentsia became an unambiguously privileged group within the society, that they could negotiate their position with party authorities and literary dignitaries, and generally speaking, they continued to live their normal lives. Also, it might be true for the RSFSR. By 1933, the Ukrainian intelligentsia was not, in Kharkiv in particular, was not only not a privileged group. It was virtually destroyed. Thousands of people were exiled and executed through individual and group criminal cases and show trials by 1934, 1935. And the time frame of events was very specific. And I believe the periodization of state terror should be reconsidered for Ukraine. Counter-Ukrainization should be more appropriately dated to 1926, which coincided with issuing two very important documents, Stalin's letter to the Central Committee of the KPBU, and the second document, the subsequent GPU circular on the Ukrainian separatism. Similarly, I believe the Great Terror in Ukraine should be more appropriately dated to 1933 rather than to 1937-38, when the entire social base of the Ukrainian society was destroyed, the peasantry and the intelligentsia. The operation that was conducted by the secret police and that was aimed at eliminating the critically thinking intelligentsia in Ukraine was so intense and so rapid that there were simply no time for any negotiations. And those little negotiations that occurred took the form of sort of shaping literary conformism. Today, thousands of criminal files are available in the state and the former KGB archives that indicate that this was the case. The second issue is the issue of subjectivity. A lot of interesting works have been written about this, such as works by, for instance, Johann Helbeck, Igor Halfin, Oleg Khordin, and many other authors. Ukrainian literati and their views and art should be considered in the context of political space in which they existed and which was very different from that in the RSFSR. My study argues precisely against the idea that the intelligentsia, the Ukrainian writers in particular, were all happy Stalinists and never strove for privacy and autonomy under state violence. From the very beginning, perhaps they subscribed to some kind of communist views. However, under state violence, their views were transformed dramatically. George Lieber has aptly noted that unlike Russian writers who were committed to Bolshevik state buildings in the 1920s, Ukrainian writers were involved in nation building. The Ukrainians strove to build a national culture and were not only forbidden to do so, but also punished through repression and execution. So I believe the automatic extrapolation and application of studies based on documents discovered in the Russian archives without considering the specifics of historical realities in Ukraine does not allow a nuanced view of national, regional, human experiences under Stalinism. Individual histories of the Slavyani, that's how they call themselves, the residents of Budynek Slova, demonstrated that for most Ukrainian intellectuals, the meaning of their lives was not derived from the state as a vehicle of the revolutionary project, but was derived from regional, national, cultural landscape. In other words, they were more nationally orientated than revolutionary. Also, they all, of course, emerged from the revolution, understanding of which, again, was very different in Russia and Ukraine. They were inspired by Ukrainization policies that were reversed in 1926, and the revolutionary project for them was to de-Russify Ukraine. The third issue that I would like to discuss here also briefly, the repression of Galicians. Also briefly, we know the story. Approximately 60,000 people from Galicia and elsewhere emigrated to Soviet Ukraine, and most of them were communists and Sovietophiles. They created a vibrant intellectual community and participated actively in cultural construction and the Ukrainization campaign. However, most of them were arrested. The physical elimination of the Galician intelligentsia in-house of writers in Kharkiv and nationally became the first step to a radical solution of regional nationalism. Moscow perceived Western Ukrainians as an ethnic group with a strong sense of national identity and internal unity, and for the party, Galicia was a nationally charged territory. For this reason, they were categorized as nationalists and potential separatists. The secret police fabricated hundreds of nationalist conspiracies and underground organizations and thousands of group and individual cases against Galicians. In the early 30s, Pavel Postashev, a little bit later, when almost all of them were arrested, called it a crusade against Galicians. And as we argue in the article written together with Myroslav Shkandrij, their repression was a strategic operation conducted by the Soviet secret organs under Moscow's supervision. The arrests of Galicians in Budynek Slova actually reflects the same trend that can be traced nationally. The fourth factor is that I would like to discuss here is a multi-ethnic factor of the repression. Despite the fact that most residents were ethnic Ukrainians in Budynek Slova, the composition of the building always remained multi-ethnic. There were Ukrainians, Russians, Jews there, Russians, for instance, Ivan Kolyanek, poet, Vladimir Yuryzansky, and many others who spoke Russian. Also, Jews, Raisa Troyanker, Lev Kvitko, David Feldman, Leonid Prvomaiskiy, and many others. Interestingly, men of Russian and Jewish origin also fell under the category of Ukrainian nationalists. Being Jewish, writers possessed double identity as Petrovsky Stern explained in his interesting study, and they were fully immersed in Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian literary discourse. They wrote in Ukrainian, they also wrote in Yiddish, in Russian, spoke Ukrainian, some of them spoke Russian and Yiddish, and but they were associated with a place that housed a nest of nationalists. Factors that played a decisive role for NKVD officials who decided their fate. And finally, a couple of words about people's behavior in prison under the threat of violence. To some extent, the writers' lives in a comfortable environment of Budynek Slova, it was comfortable in the beginning, prepared the grounds for their moral degradation in prison, and many people wrote about the Slavyanis' bohemian life in Budynek Slova in their attempt actually to ingratiate themselves with the state and with the secret police. In his memoirs, Yamen Emeni, Shevelyov insisted that the lumpen origin, bohemian lifestyle, the level of physical and moral purity and human decency had a common root. He characterized some writers' behavior as immoral and their literary talent as rudimentary, stihiyny, based on very limited education. Of course, the fear factor was decisive. Most people confessed their crimes. Mass confessions perpetuated the terror. Most surrendered their will and principles. And by 1933, Budynek Slova lost its original authentic meaning, a place of freedom and a place of creativity, which violated and destroyed, in many cases, people's feeling of identity. Why do I believe that this study is significant? It's significant for me, but why do I believe that it might be significant for other scholars and for maybe for this part of Ukrainian history? First, through observing lesser spaces and places, I believe a bigger space or reality become more transparent and evident for us. Budynek Slova is such a lesser place, a place which remained unrepresented, unread, and unexamined for a long, long time. A place which helps more fully understand Stalin's terror and human behavior. Second, for me, it was just, of course, there was a historiographical rationale, the ongoing discussion of the question why terror in Ukraine has produced heated scholarly debates, and I believe the issue of the intentionality of state violence in Ukraine, as well as accompanying rationales, remains largely unsettled. I also believe that this research about Budynek Slova challenges Russocentric view of the nature of terror in Ukraine, which is rarely challenged. My study, which is grounded in archival evidence, constitutes an alternative view, which considers repression a carefully planned operation in the context of the growing centralization of power in Moscow. Most importantly, an analysis of cultural disruption that occurred in the 1930s in Ukraine helps us, I believe, better understand the current pernicious trend in contemporary Ukrainian society and its ability to preserve, to develop, and to protect its language and culture. I believe in the mid-30s, the intellectual potential of the nation was irreversibly damaged, if not lost, a negative condition for the nation-building project. Shevelyov once wrote, I will allow myself to quote him in Ukrainian, «Розквіт мистецтва не стоїть у прямому і обов'язковому зв'язку з побудуванням національної держави. Але не можна твердити і протилежного, що жодного зв'язку між цими двома рядами подій взагалі нема». And I believe the interconnectedness of the cultural and nation-building projects discussed by Shevelyov becomes even more obvious when it is discussed in the context of these tremendous human losses and cultural disruption in Ukraine in the 1930s caused by Stalin's terror, and it is also evident today when Ukraine fights for its sovereignty, independence, and survival. The most important rationale for this study for me was a humanistic rationale. My task was to better understand and explain human behavior under state violence in one place, Ukraine, the House of Writers. The Slavyan and the Ukrainian writer Ivan Bakhmut, whom I remember when I was 5, 6, 7, who was repressed in 1935 but survived the Gulag, said on his deathbed in 1975, "Все брехня, everything is a lie." Hopefully the history of Budynok Slova will help us understand not only those who were eliminated in the 1930s, but also those who were disillusioned in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and those who are disheartened today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga, for a most comprehensive and at the same time personal, very personal, but based on archival material presentation. Our next speaker will be Professor Myroslav Shkandrij. His subject is Enthusiasm Kharkiv in the mid-1920s. And let me just briefly say that Professor Shkandrij is a professor at the University of Manitoba and has many publications, about 10 books, I believe. So among them, the most recent work that he has published is Jews in Ukrainian Literature, Representations and Identity. That's Yale University Press in 2009. And most recent is Ukrainian Nationalism, Politics, Ideology, and Literature, 1929 to 56, which will be coming out by Yale University Press in 2015. Is it out?
It's out.
Wonderful. So let me present Professor Shkandrij.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I met Yuri Shevelyov once after a conference and during the reception, the party. I asked him, why did you stop writing literature, literary criticism? Why did you kill off Shkandrij and return to being Shevelyov? And he said, you know, I could tell you, but you're going to think that I'm showing off. And I said, no, of course not. I wouldn't think that at all. He said, well, when I write an article in literary criticism, it takes me maybe 3 days. But when I have to write an article in linguistics, well, then you really have to think, you have to work at it. It takes me a long time. So I thought, what a show-off. You know? Another experience I had with him was listening to a talk about, I think he was talking about linguistics. And he kept saying, I'm going to speak to the topic, but I'm going to keep sinning. I'm going to periodically speak about politics. And each time I sin, I will ask for your forgiveness. So it's really hard to speak about literature, to speak about culture, Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian culture, without drifting into politics. It's very hard to do, but I think it needs doing. This is required, especially of literary scholars. We should at least try. And this paper is an attempt to shift the focus away from a narrow political approach to explore aesthetic, other ways of looking at the 1920s. And I'm going to do it by trying to think about creative enthusiasm, the creative enthusiasm that was shown in the 1920s. The imagination of most readers pictures Kharkiv in this layered way, maybe the Kharkiv of the original Cossack elite, maybe the Kharkiv of Kvitkos-Novianenko in the 1830s, maybe the Kharkiv of Alexei Storozhenko, and later. And all of these are particularly interesting because of the ebullience, the sense of energy and vitality these writers show. But the most optimistic time, when Kharkiv is most associated with this optimistic faith in the future, was, of course, during the Cultural Renaissance of the 1920s, when it was the capital of the new Soviet Ukrainian Republic. And when it sort of thought of itself as marching towards a better world. The collective project of writers and artists at that time was a very ambitious one, the creation and the depiction of a new identity. But there were different interpretations of what that meant. Firstly, it involved a national dimension, the creation of a literature and art that revealed in modern form a rich Ukrainian culture, a history, and identity. The Ukrainian language, as we have heard, was standardized in the so-called Kharkiv orthography of 1928. A high-quality experimental literature and writing was produced with different groups, all promoting innovative, intellectual, modern, urban creativity. They relied on the resources of Ukraine's past, even when they broke from tradition. And they quite explicitly refused to subordinate themselves to trends in Russia. This produced a creative elan and brilliant works. But there was a second dimension to this Renaissance of the 1920s, and it was heralded as producing a proletarian culture, something that was new on a global scale. Kharkiv was to become the new center of this proletarian creativity that demonstrated also a complete break with the rural, the bourgeois, the individual. The image of proletarian newness was associated with machinery, speed, technique, technical innovation, collective work. Like the national, this proletarian dimension of the Renaissance demanded new forms. In literature, the use of acronyms and technical terms, for example, became popular. Some of the technical experimentation was modeled on the use of on the devices of cinema, the use of camera angles, montage, experiments in quick transition, fragmentation, unexpected combinations, recombinations, shots from unusual angles, and a revolt against established genres. There were amazing attempts to write text collectively, to mix media. And in fact, 1928 produced an entire spate of such amazing experimental works, obsessed with technique, the process of creation itself. Most of these have never been analyzed, and most of this has never been really talked about as kind of a phenomenon in itself. The enthusiasm released by this second dimension sometimes contradicted or clashed with the ideas of the first. In the cultural debates of the mid-20s, some participants asked, was the Ukrainian language an apt vehicle for the proletarian reworking of culture? Should the Ukrainian past be discarded as predominantly peasant? Or was it the Russian and imperial past that should be jettisoned? And who, in any case, was responsible for creating the new art? As we know, these questions all involve politics, organization, ideology, and they quickly became entangled with the creative endeavors, causing discord. And then in the 30s, many writers and artists who had taken part with great enthusiasm in the Cultural Renaissance would be arrested, imprisoned, exiled, or shot. Although we know that, of course, these currents could not be removed from politics and ideology, but it is worth thinking about this aesthetic dimension that generated them. So I propose that a simple juxtaposition of modernists versus massists, aesthetics versus ethics, as Ria Samovchan has proposed recently, or even pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, sophisticated versus primitive, is inadequate. The term modernist, after all, encompasses experiments of those creating proletarian culture. In retrospect, the turning point was the first five-year plan of 1928 to 33. Described as Stalin's second revolution, it led to the collectivization of agriculture, rapid forced industrialization, eventually to the Great Famine and the curtailment of the Ukrainization policy that had been fervently embraced by many after 1923. However, initially, at least in some circles, the second Stalinist revolution also produced its own upsurge of enthusiasm. It claimed to be making an even more complete break with the past than the national or proletarian revolutions. It viewed collective work in more radical terms, not simply as collaboration, but as collectivism, whose hallmarks were discipline, uniformity, the militarization of society, the complete subordination of Kharkiv to Moscow and the Kremlin. The emphasis was not anymore on even glorifying the worker, but glorifying the state. This third enthusiasm also demanded a new literature and art, along with new organizational forms and a new ideology. It moved away from celebrating human ingenuity to admiring the gigantism of state-sponsored projects like hydroelectric dams, enormous chimneys, factory complexes, away from exploiting natural rhythms to breaking them. Because Ukrainian scholarship has not paid much attention to the aesthetics of this third Stalinist enthusiasm, it often fails to identify it and distinguish its particularities from the others. Marko Pavlyushin is one of very few scholars who has even suggested that there might be an aesthetic here worth exploring. He says, perhaps someday we will learn to use in our cultural system even the creations of socialist realism as sentimental kitsch. So, in short, when energy and enthusiasm of creative people in the 20s is examined more closely, one finds different sources of inspiration. This is the thesis I'm putting before you now. The quest for sophistication and the romanticization of the national cultural development is one source of enthusiasm. The thrill of creating a new proletarian culture is another. And the excitement of belonging to a strong, unified industrial state is a third. These produced different aesthetic currents, different formal elements, different appreciations of the beautiful even. Today, as we look back on this history, we tend to see it through the prism of what came later. The famine, the arrests and purges, the crushing of a generation of creative people. But we tend to forget, I believe, that the enthusiasms, although ambiguous and sometimes forced, were real. They motivated millions, they left their mark on creative work. Shkandrij captured some of the excitement felt by this generation in his marvelous essays and sketches. His Khvylyovy bez politiki, Khvylyovy without politics, today reads like a manifesto of the national cultural revival of the 20s. Yuri Lavrinenko's classic text, Rozsтріляне відродження, the executed Renaissance, also brims with a passionate commitment and the thrilling sense of discovery felt by this generation. And of course, Mykola Khvylyovy's pamphlets and the literary discussion itself of the mid-20s bear witness to the aspirations of the creative individuals grouped around him. In Khvylyovy bez politiki, Shkandrij indicates several features in the artistic platform of the Khvylyovy group: a love of playful delight in language, a desire for the full, unedited, uncensored human experience, a life-affirming joy that brought with it a kind of wise optimism. When discussing delight in language, he quotes a passage from Khvylyovy's story in which the narrator says, «Марія, ти наївничаєш, нічого подібного не було, я тільки приніс тобі запах слова». Nothing happened nothing that I've said actually happened. I only wanted to bring you the flavor, the scent of language. Shkandrij comments that the scent of the word can be ironic, mystical, or sacred. And he says, unfortunately, our literature over the last 20 years has completely lost the ability to sense and recreate the scent of words. On love of life, love of people, he quotes several now well-known phrases, among them Pavlo Tychina's aeroplanes and all the achievements of technology. What are they worth if people do not look one another in the eye? Аероплани і все довершенство техніки. До чого ж це, коли люди одне одному в вічі не дивляться? And he cites another wonderful passage from Ivan Senchenko. I am a citizen who cares about the full-blooded health of his contemporaries. I have to call out, down with skepticism, with sarcasms and ironies. Я громадянин, якому дороге повнокровне здоров'я своїх сучасників. Я мушу гукати геть із скептицизмом, із сарказмами і іроніями. Shkandrij says that this optimism did not close its eyes to the monstrous in the world. It included not only the smile, but also tears, not only life, but also death. On the desire for a full, unedited experience, Scherach quotes Yuri Janowski. We know all the harmfulness and falseness of simplified emotions. So these writers explored also the erotic, the psychological, the philosophical. In Scherach's words, their goal was the fully developed Ukrainian individual, and for expressing the music in the human soul. They were open to all sorts of experiences, and they explored various kinds of literary styles: neo-romanticism, impressionism, expressionism, symbolism. Scherach also describes in highly negative terms, as we have heard, those who opposed the National Cultural Revolution, those who denied the creation of what he called the Third Kharkiv. In his essay, he expresses anger at the compromises, the collaborators. The other Soviet literature, he says, talked nonsense about Stakhanovites, shock workers, life being better and happier after flowering cities in a flowering Ukraine. These compromises belong to a system that created ersatz feelings, substitute feelings, manufactured false happiness, and that happiness had to be uniform, the same for everyone. The enthusiasm of the first current, the National Cultural Renaissance, was crushed. But here's the difficult part. What do we do with the other two forms of enthusiasm? How do we integrate them into a narrative of the period? The plans and projects of the proletarian revolution and the second Stalinist revolution lashed out at the old, but so did the National Cultural Revolution, the Renaissance, associated with Khvolyovyi and the Vidrodzinci, the people of the Renaissance. They also wanted radical change. We can argue that the vision of the Vidrodzinci was different. They saw national liberation as coinciding with social liberation. Their new beginning was to be built upon old foundations. The image of Urbino, which I mentioned in my first book on modernist Marxists and the nations, captures this. This Urbino was the name of the first group that the Khvolyovyi tried to form out of the proletarian organization Hart in the early 1920s. But the name Urbino also stood not just for urbanization of culture, but it was a reference to a town in Italy which in the 15th century became the center of Renaissance humanism. On the orders of the Duke of Urbino, artists constructed a unique city in the form of an asymmetrical palace that made use of pre-existing structures, an edifice of symphonic complexity and grandeur built on previous foundations. This can be seen as a metaphor for what the Vidrodzinci were trying to do. Their new was to be built on the old, the European, the sophisticated. It had a link with the Ukrainian past. One could argue that the literature, the art of many avant-garde groups in the 20s, like the great silent films of Alexander Dovzhenko, captured the same message. The old and new were contrasted, but were linked. They revealed these films revealed deep continuities between the past and the present, philosophical, spiritual continuities. By contrast, the proletarian and Stalinist revolutions sometimes viewed anything that was sophisticated as a threat, anything that was linked to the Ukrainian past as suspicious, retrograde, even counter-revolutionary. All three forms of enthusiasm had something in common. The 20s, after all, was the decade of the avant-garde. The idea of change, modernity, and urbanization captured the imaginations of many in the younger generation. In their view, the artist ought to be a visionary, even a fanatic. Exceptional talent, recognition of the ability to break through to new forms of consciousness was celebrated. And this actually, incidentally, was true not only of writing within Soviet Ukraine, but of Ukrainians in the interwar generation and in Galicia, the so-called nationalist writers. Oleg Olzhich, the own spokesman on cultural affairs, Yevhen Malanyuk, Yuri Lipa, and other leading figures in emigration, glorified the demiurge, the artist, ahead of his time, and they admired in particular this generation of Kharkiv writers. Avant-gardism, the pursuit of the new and visionary, was therefore something that all three revolutionary enthusiasms had in common. And the nationalist revolutionary enthusiasm, if you want to call that a fourth. It was evident in the attraction to the dynamic and vital, which expressed itself in various forms. In the cult of health, physical strength, endurance, which you see in Yanovsky, Vlisko, Lyubchenko, Johansson, Khvolyovy. The human body, its psychological and physical strength in Yanovsky and Khvolyovy, animalistic urges in Lyubchenko, even the energy and landscapes of Johansson. All this spoke a language of optimistic faith in human nature's ability to overcome obstacles and create the new. The individual artist with the courage to explore new horizons was celebrated. In the proletarian current, this avant-garde attraction to vitalism was translated into a celebration of the new working class's drive and accomplishments. We are perhaps now most familiar with those powerful bronze bodies of laborers that were lovingly captured in films. The innocent, childlike, unspoiled, naive, even primitive was elevated in opposition to the excessively sophisticated, westernized, and bourgeois. The worker in the writings of many authors, including people like Petro Panch and Ryholovko, is portrayed as straightforward, direct, untutored, hence trustworthy. There was enthusiasm for technique, of course, for technical innovation, experimentation in this current, but it was generally linked to the ingenious worker-creator. Then there came the third, Stalinist enthusiasm, in which this idea of the avant-garde and vital got twisted into something infantile, robotic. The worker became all muscle, no reflection, all nursery rhymes and marching rhythms. Unabashed propaganda took the place of critical thought. For me, Tchina's strange verse from the late 20s and early 30s falls into this category, along with the rhymed doggerel praising the leader, the party, the plan, the army, the state, which soon became typical of socialist realism. We are now most familiar with this kind of cultural production in the works of socialist realism that were produced in the 30s and later. But the seeds of this thinking were already present in the 20s. In 1927, O. Skripnik wrote, "The issue is not to discover," I think that's the son of Mikhail Skripnik. "The issue is not to discover and incorrectly build the link between cultural work and the economy, but to now view cultural educational work as the industrialization of man's brain." What a great phrase. Industrialization of man's brain. The industrialization of qualified human material. Справа стоїть не в тому, щоб знайти і правильно збудувати зв'язок між культурною роботою і господаркою, а в тому, щоб тепер культурно-освітню роботу розглядати як індустріалізацію чоловічого мозку, індустріалізацію кваліфікованого людського матеріалу. The ambition of this third revolutionary enthusiasm was not to release the genius in the individual, but to glorify a kind of utilitarian functionalism. Brilliance was not in the individual or even the group's creator, but in the plan which had sprung from the mind of a great leader. Of course, no, I'm not arguing that the enthusiasm of any of these groups was totally free. These writers were watched in one way or another. But there still was in the mid-20s a larger degree of freedom than what came at the end of the 20s and the beginning of the 30s. So these three kinds of aesthetic, the three kinds of formal experimentation can be illustrated in various ways. Theater gradually moved from the national romanticism of Mykola Kulish's plays to the Stalinist vision of Ivan Mikotenko's Diktatura. Film moved from the depiction of national transformation in Alexander Dovzhenko's Zvenivara, Arsenal, Zemlya, to the glorification of proletarian vigor and construction in his Ivan. The movement is from natural rhythms to the subduing and channeling of these rhythms by a proletarian strongman, and finally to the triumph of the impersonal plan. Whereas Dziga-Vertov's Человек с киноаппаратом, Man with the Movie Camera of 1930, still celebrates personal ingenuity and creativity and suggests the ideal of an individual's liberation from outdated false consciousness, his later enthusiasm gives way to scenes of proletarian masses pledging themselves to work harder. Here we have moved from a delight in human creativity to praise for the plan and the great planner. Exploring these links to history has been replaced by celebrating freedom from the links to history. The problem in dealing with the aesthetic underpinning of the second and third enthusiasm can be illustrated by looking at Vertov's two films. Both were remarkable experiments, even though they belong to the proletarian revolution or proletarian wave of sense of a proletarian culture, or to the Stalin, can be assimilated to the Stalinist view of things. There's still a remarkable cultural experiment. So I'll just give you a few slides because we don't have an opportunity to see the entire film, of course. But these are well worth seeing, these films. How do I do that? Here, right? No. So these films are now available, by the way. The Ukrainian Ministry of Culture has made them available. This is from Enthusiasm. The vision of Kharkiv, Eastern Ukraine, the industrialization project, the awakening of people through sound. This was the first sound film produced in Ukrainian, and it was a wonderful experiment made by people who designed their own sound equipment, went into mines, worked tremendously with tremendous enthusiasm. And the portrayal of individuals as these powerful workers, these powerful thinkers, these powerful engineers. So here you have a portrait of one of these creative thinkers who's devising the new proletarian culture. The assaults on the sounds of the Donbass, they went there, they filmed, they brought back all this information, and they edited on, without sound tables. It was all done in an inspired way. But you know what? When you look at these films, there's a lot of information about Ukrainianization, the Ukrainianization process, the films, the books, the processions, the plan itself, the use of Ukrainian in the film. These are all reminders of the national cultural revolution. The conference in Kharkiv, the all-party conference of 1929, filmed and used in the film, and of course, portraits of Lenin. The proletarian aspect of this is this monumentalism, smokestacks, chimneys, and then you have the Stalinist view of group action, mechanized people, people walking in step, marching in step. It's my view that when you actually look carefully at these films, the propaganda message is often subverted by what you see. And this is one reason why this film and Vertov's other films were taken out of circulation. His message of cinema verité, of the camera being allowed to view everything, revealed too much. And in the end, revealed bad working conditions very often, the treatment of ordinary people, and this was not what the regime wanted to be seen. So, in conclusion, as with other great films of this time, such as Dovzhenko's Arsenal, Earth, Vertov's Man with the Movie Camera, and Enthusiasm, the message was supposed to contrast a degenerate past with a radiant future. But the thoughtful viewer inevitably today notices the military metaphor with which this film in particular, Enthusiasm, ends, with song into battle. The Orwellian Big Brother voice, the message that the individual is nothing while the state is everything. Therefore, the idea that the individual has to be mechanized, industrialized, forced to produce more and at a faster pace evokes resistance. It acts on the contemporary viewer, at least, as a condemnation of the system as much as a celebration. But my idea is that you can see all three of these enthusiasms together, and the task is for an analyst is to disentangle them. Kharkiv, the capital of Ukraine until 1934, was the symbolic generator of all three of these enthusiasms and aesthetics, which today layer our awareness of this remarkable period of creativity. A more fruitful approach to the achievements of the period might be to begin looking at the different aesthetics or the different forms of expression. Thank you for your attention. Як це зняти? Вийти and show. Я вийду, а тоді ви можете.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker in this afternoon session is Dr. Halyna Hryn, who is a literary scholar, and she's the president of the vice president of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, and she is the editor of the journal Harvard Ukrainian Studies. Her research interests center on Soviet Ukrainian literature and cultural policies of the 20s and 30s, and her monograph, The Literaturny Yarmarok, Ukrainian Modernism and Defining Moment, is forthcoming by Kritika. She's also quite an outstanding translator, and translated some wonderful works by Volodymyr Dibrova, by Oksana Zabushko, as well as edited several volumes on Holodomor of great significance. Her paper today is on the Yarmarok, I believe, Literary Kharkiv in 1929, Engagement and Modernism. Dr. Hryn.
Thank you very much. This period is, of course, so rich, and it is difficult how to speak about it because there are a number of people that have worked on it. I have followed in Myroslav's footsteps and in Myroslava Mudrak's footsteps. So I was anxious to do something much different from what we had done before, and in the end, I actually ended up doing a completely new take and something rather similar along the lines. At least I have tried to grapple with the questions, perhaps in a different way. But the period is rich and it's difficult to get at. It is multifaceted, and I think, Myroslav, that was a wonderful presentation, and I think that there is still much work to be done to get to the bottom of it. In the summer of 1923, Pavlo Tychyna moved to Kharkiv to take up the position of poetry editor of the new national journal Червоний шлях, and shortly afterwards wrote his inspired signature poem about the city, which, as long as no one else had cited, I believe deserves to be mentioned, at least once during this conference. Kharkiv, Kharkiv, де твоє обличчя, до кого твій клич? У грусти глийке многоріччя, темне як ніч. Kharkiv, as we heard this morning, has had a wonderful poem, of course, much overquoted, but in fact, as most of Tychyna's early poetry, a very wonderful poem. As we've heard, of course, Kharkiv has been both a center of Ukrainian activity and during certain periods, and also it has had less of a Ukrainian role in others. In the 19th century, we heard about the early of the Romantic period, which was very fruitful, very rich. The city steadily gained importance as a Russian imperial center, growing, and towards the end of the 19th century, it had a prominent Ukrainian presence. There was the Alchevsky family, the industrialist who invested heavily in the mines. There was Boris Hrinchenko, the scholars Alexander Potebnya, Dmitro Bagalii. Kharkiv was also the site of the early Ukrainian political parties. The Brotherhood of Taras, the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party, were all founded there. It was also the center in which Ukrainian artists such as Vasyl Kryczewski received their education and training. So thus, while Kharkiv, like most 19th century cities in Ukraine, could not be described as predominantly Ukrainian, neither was it alien to the Ukrainophile movement. However, during the revolutionary period, Ukrainian cultural life unequivocally shifts to Kyiv, which rises to undisputed leadership in the Ukrainian movement's political life. Kharkiv's proximity to the Russian border and the Bolshevik-controlled Donbass were determining factors in this divergence. And although in April 1917 there was the gubernatorial council was founded to support the Rada, there were congresses and prosvita educational societies. By November 1917, Kharkiv fell under Bolshevik control, and except for some sporadic attempts to win it back, it never, after 1919, it never did return. So one could say that the Ukrainian revolution, the Ukrainian aspect of the revolution, did not figure in Kharkiv. For example, during the so-called second Bolshevik invasion, which is between February and June 1919, when Kyiv exploded with cultural activity of Ukrainian, of Jewish, Ukrainian, Russian, or Russian presence in the new structures created by the Soviet power. In Kharkiv, there was practically nobody. There was a Ukrainian writer, minor writer, Mikhailo Dolenko, and Volodymyr Koryak, who was given oversight of the Ukrainian Center, and Alexander Biletsky, the future great scholar. Those were the three people who were involved in Ukrainian culture then. At the same time, and this is typical of I suppose living in a parallel reality. At the same time in Kharkiv, there were the futurists Grigory Petnikov, Alexander Gastyev. For a time, it became the hiding place for writers such as Mandelstam, Pasternak, Khlebnikov, who all and Babel writing his Konarmiya. All these people actually worked for the Ukrainian Soviet government. So you had a strong Russian presence and almost no Ukrainian presence. Things did not really begin to shift until the Ukrainization, the declaration of the policy of Korenizatsiya throughout the Soviet Union in 1923, and that was when the Ukrainian presence had to pretty much start all over again. So the question then is, 6 years later, in 1929, the situation had changed dramatically. Ukrainians had made the city their own. It was the new capital. It was a modern, exciting center of Ukrainian urban culture of the type capable of having Yuri Sherich, Yuri Shevelov come over to that side. And I think that question of how something like that happened in such a short period of time is something that can be looked at. As far as cities who have, as far as city texts, I think the work mentioned by Myroslav Shkandrij, The Nature of Creativity, this is a work that begins «Город, я безумно люблю город, я люблю виходити ввечері із своєї кімнати, йти на шумні бульвари». This is a very complex piece on the nature of artistic creativity, a paean by Khvylyovey to the city of Kharkiv, and it is a sign of the turnaround. The story of Mykola Khvylyovey, the literary discussion, the organization Vaplite, is one of the more enduring mythologized narratives of the 1920s decade. That discussion realigned forces within all the literary organizations into two camps: those who would break out of the ever-tightening strictures of political control to follow a modernist agenda, and those who would not. The dramatic events were played out in the city of Kharkiv, and it was these events that transformed it into the cultural center, the Ukrainian cultural capital that it became. I would propose that modernism should be the chief paradigm by which Ukrainian culture of the first half of the 20th century is to be examined, as has already been discussed, provided that the definition is not limited to aestheticism, symbolism, and secession, but subsumes the avant-garde in all its manifestations. This is especially important for the Ukrainian case because it is only with modernism that Ukrainian culture enters a sustained engagement with the West. This question was vital throughout the 1920s. It became a founding principle of the Emigre Cultural Association, MUR, which unfortunately did not get covered during this conference, but in which Shevelyov was absolutely instrumental, and was further developed by emigre writers in the 1960s. And even socialist realism, which can be, on the one hand, described as something of an aberration from modernism, witnessed, as Myroslav has been just speaking, some curious hybrid forms whereby ideologically sound, seemingly sound, and simplistic works in fact harbors sophisticated formalist technique, as has been claimed by some of the later works by Tychina, Partiya Vede, Chernihiv, and so on. Moreover, much of the militant theorizing of this second enthusiasm attending the violent imposition of socialist realism drew directly from the modernist arsenal. Ideas of creating a new man and of art accepting the psyche, all of the theoretical works of the prolet cult were drawing, in fact, very much on Nietzschean ideas. One might argue, for example, that those features at the core of socialist realism, and this is in its final incarnation, naivete, gross simplification, powerlessness, ideological obedience, can be in fact looked at as extra-literary. Because I would say that whereas postmodernist use of kitsch remains nonetheless an intellectual exercise, it is precisely the lack of an intellectual component or an artistic sense at all that makes socialist realism so peculiar. And this is what Mykola Khvelevey fought hardest against. And so in that kind of approach, I would say that all of these things that were discussed in the previous paper are still nonetheless modernist expressions. And what, in fact, the socialist realism that was the problem was, in fact, not really something that carried either an artistic or an intellectual component. As Ukrainian culture began to chart its new course after the ravages of the First World War and the Ukrainian-Russian War that followed, it was already well acquainted with European modernism. Many of the figures who laid the foundations of post-revolutionary artistic and theoretical education had previously studied abroad. Mikhailo Boychuk, and this I am indebted to the work done by Myroslava Mudrak. Mikhailo Boychuk had trained with the Nabi in Paris and later maintained his own teaching studio there. Georgi Narbut has served as secretary of the World of Art organization in St. Petersburg, which was the primary Art Nouveau organization. Les Kurbas had studied acting with Josef Kainz in Vienna. He was influenced by the experiments of Max Reinhardt, Georg Fuchs, Edward Gordon Craig. And in the mid to late 20s, the Ukrainian Commissariat of Education, specifically Alexander Shumsky, lobbied hard to bring those who had not returned during the revolution, to bring the remaining former compatriots, lobby them to get them back to Ukraine. And so then people such as Volodymyr Tatlin, Vasil Kasyan, later, under possibly different circumstances, Kazimir Malevich, the Russians, Viktor Palmov, Pavel Golubyatnikov, returned to lay foundations for really a cultural revival that was capable of transforming Kharkiv and capable of being attractive and, in fact, capable of providing an alternative to the to what was being produced in Russia, and that was ultimately what made it unacceptable. I would make the case that Ukrainian literature and culture of the 1920s can only be interpreted as a continuation of those modernist avant-garde trends that reached their zenith in Western Europe on the eve of World War I. It is something of an irony that whereas the trauma of the Great War pushed Western art in the direction of absurdist Dada, surrealism, expressionist, grotesque, the Ukrainians, whose own war was no less traumatic, probably more, rushed to embrace these pre-war traditions with great enthusiasm. As part of the Russian Empire, Ukrainian cities of Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa had not been subject prior to the war to the same kind of provincial status that they were to later gain during the Soviet period. In other words, the Ukrainian 1920s literature grew from a base that was far broader than the diachronic progression of Shevchenko, Franko, Lesa Ukrainka, Moloda Muza, Ukrainska Khata, and then out of nowhere come all of these new writings. It moves beyond the Ukrainophile spectrum and draws equally comfortably from Russian formalists, Scythians, Acmeists, Western realist novels, French Parnassians, and Maupassant, accessing in 1922 simultaneously with their Russian counterparts the three latest rages among the intelligentsia: Einstein, Oswald Spengler, The Decline of the West, and Pierre Benoit's sensational novel Atlantis. So at the time that all of these writers who were to create this new culture were coming of age, they were exposed through Russian culture or through travels to the West or through travels to Vienna to a very broad range of activity, and that is by absorbing all of these new phenomenon is what allowed them to create this new art. The literary discussion officially ended in on February 21st, 1928, with Mykola Skripnik, the Commissar of Education, delivering its closing remarks. On the following day, Khvylyovei's letter of recantation was published in the main party newspaper. A month earlier, Vaplite had disbanded. Skripnik urged that all literary currents and styles coexist in free competition as long as they avoided politics. He welcomed left art organizations such as Nova Generacija and Avantgarde and encouraged less jeering and more aesthetic, artistic analysis on the part of the critics. He urged artists to differentiate themselves according to political views, not according to political views, but by artistic styles. By the end of the year, Khvylyovei and his Vaplite cohorts received permission to publish a new monthly almanac, called Literaturny Yarmarok. Permission to publish Literaturny Yarmarok, which became, by some definitions, of course, did not cover everyone, but made its best, the best efforts that it could, became a pinnacle, or at least an opportunity to look back at everything that had happened in the previous decade. It drew together, following the Borobis tradition, it drew most of the Ukrainian artistic currents under its wing. Permission to publish this journal had been secured by Khvylyovei at the price of his contrition. His recantation that was published in Kommunist on the day after Skripnik's speech, his condemnation of the errors of Khvylyovism, Shumskism, the majority of the Communist Party of Western Ukraine. The price was high, but evidently enough to secure a modus vivendi between the party and the Vaplite group. Even the former archenemy Andriy Khvelya, who was now head of Agitprop, not only gave permission for Literaturny Yarmarok, but also consistently defended them from Nova Generacija and WUSP criticism. It was as though the artist had ceded all authority for literary criticism to the new Marxist journal Kritika, and concentrated on securing the best literary works for Literaturny Yarmarok. While this arrangement was not entirely satisfactory, it did give the appearance that the unruly had been disciplined and were now going to behave. After all, the ritual of samokritika, confession and absolution so aptly satirized in Khvelevey's Ivan Ivanovich, was becoming the dominant mode of communist behavior and was acceptable. There's another reason why the party would have been amenable to this alliance. One of the chief objectives of the June 1926 plenum had been to drive a wedge between Ukrainian communist writers and the old intelligentsia, to break the so-called Burgfrieden, as Koryak had put it, by making it a breach of party discipline to support neoclassicists. Shortly afterwards, in September 1926, as already mentioned, the security services presented the Ukrainian Politburo with detailed analysis of the essence, history, and tactics of Ukrainian separatism, including concrete proposals of what the GPU could do in this regard. It identified separatism's most dangerous centers, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Church and the All-Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, MUAN. As permission of Literaturny Yarmarok was being granted, the campaign against one of Wuhan's most respected academicians, Serhiy Yefremov, had already begun. And the groundwork, of course, was being laid for the trial of the Union of Liberation for Ukraine. So there was a very short window of opportunity. It was really the period between the summer or early 1929 and when this trial would go into full swing, that the journal could create what it could create. And during this time, some of the best works of the period were published from not only from the Vaplite group. One of the closest allies were the group Avant-Garde, even some of the futurists who were very much in conflict with the Vaplite group through most of his time. Some of their more interesting writers also came over to the Vaplite side. In the time between December 1928 and February 1930, 12 issues of the almanac appeared, some with considerable delay. The colorful dust jackets were the work of Anatoly Petretsky. Individual artists were commissioned to create a carousel for each issue and to sketch drawings in the margins. An anonymous editorial board, Yarmarkom, took credit for the first 2 issues. Subsequent volumes had individual editors, each with his own autobiography written by a good friend. There were no articles on current affairs or editorials as such. Every issue contained a prologue, epilogue, circulars, announcements, a calendar, showcasing specific artists' sketchbooks, and a carousel. Miniature drawings, and of course instead of editorials there were literary works called intermedia, which were exercises in commenting on contemporary affairs, and in fact on leading an intellectual discussion among the initiated with the assistance of humor, and in that way maintaining a creative force in and around the journal. The works were, during that year, the atmosphere was one really of a crucible of creativity. The works were a collaborative effort. Very often the same characters would appear, whether in Kulish's Binda Mazailo or Khvelevey's Ivan Ivanovich. It was clearly things were moving forward at a very fast pace, and perhaps one of the most interesting works of that period was Johansson's Podorож Učeного доктора Leonardo, which adopted many of the ideas. In fact, one could call it a formalist novel incorporating the ideas of Shklovsky and the Russian formalism. I think at this point I will focus on one particular aspect, and that is the carousel, which again shows except that it has now disappeared. Okay. Well, maybe not then. Oh, is that? It is supposed to be at the bottom. I'm not seeing it. It's
What's the title?
The title was called Presentation Slides.
Not background slide?
Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Oh, that's what you did. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I will quickly. It was not only artists it was not only the writers who were brought in from all aspects. This journal consolidated not only literary figures, but most of the leading artistic groups of the period. So there were two covers. It began with this somewhat Gogolian, idyllic scene, possibly from one of Petritsky's decorations for one of the theatrical performances. This was the cover for the first 7 issues. When it became too agrarian and not industrial enough, the new cover was one movement. This is what happens when you're okay. This is the cover showing industrialization, harvesting. You see all of these bags of wheat being processed, very much along the constructivist enthusiasm theme that we saw by Vertov. The carousel, this particular carousel from the first issue was designed also by Petritsky, the constructivist, and the statement is «Ало всім говорить ярмарком літературного ярмарку на хвилі 500 метрів міста Харкова» in the Ukrainian. So this is this radio station Yarmarkom is announcing itself in the city of Kharkiv, the capital of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. Welcome to our journal. Please subscribe. Here we have it in another issue. But except here you have it Ukrainianized as halo, 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 sim. Говорить Yarmarkom. This speaking na chvili is something interesting because a few weeks later, on January 9th, 1929, so this is like this issue first comes out in December of 1928. Berezil Theater launches it premieres its first musical review called Ало на хвилі 477. Hello, this is radio frequency 477, which was the main frequency of the Kharkiv radio. The text was written by none other but Mike Johansson and Ostap Vishnya, collaborators of Literaturny Yarmarok, and under the general direction of Les Kurbas, but new work by new directors, sets designed by Vadim Meller, music by the very contemporary artist Yuri Meitus and Kryzhenivsky. In giving an interview to the Visti VK, the main journal on that occasion, Les Kurbas expressed the hope that the production would lay the foundation for the development of the Ukrainian light genre, such as operetta, satire, popular music shows, and the circus. The theatrical review was one of the fastest growing popular genres in the 1920s, described by some as the last gasp attempt to forestall the mass exodus of theater audiences in the direction of movie palaces. These spectacles reached their apogee on the affluent stages of Paris, New York, and Berlin, where directors would spend up to $250,000 for a single production, employing hundreds of performers. During the fall and winter season, 9 revues were inaugurated in Berlin alone. And half a year later, in the reminiscences of Josip Hirnyak, who happened to be in Berlin at the time, there was Kurbas in Berlin scouting out these shows, walking down Unter den Linden, heading for the next review show. By 1929, this was already produced in Kharkiv. So the Literaturny Yarmarok carousel was laden with meaning. It stood as a symbol for the Vaplite program for creating a modern, urban, indigenous Ukrainian culture. By addressing the reader, allo, 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 in clear reference to the upcoming Berezil musical, Literaturny Yarmarok was declaring itself a part of the jazz age, in which the city of Kharkiv, the capital of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, was no longer a sleepy provincial outpost of somebody else's empire, but a center forging its own tentative path to the stages of Berlin. Very quickly, I will show you, this is a carousel by someone of the Boychuk school, Padalka, who had moved from Kyiv to teach at the Kharkiv Art Institute and nurtured a group of very interesting graphic artists. This is an interview, an autobiography of Mike Johansson written by Senchenko. So this is, again, this tongue-in-cheek, continuous satire, esoteric references, things that the censors couldn't possibly understand. This is already a more radical group of Boychukists. You see, you have the class struggle there. You have, I believe, a priest, a bourgeois person, somebody, a capitalist. I'm not sure who the third one is. You have another one with airplanes, cars, and so on. So every issue had a different artist, a different group. One of the most beloved old artists, the creator of the Poltava Zemstvo of 1905, Vasil Kryczewski, who was incredibly versatile. Not only did he do set designs for Dovzhenko's Zvenehora, book designs, as we'll see in a moment, but here we have, he began by following the works of the arts and crafts movement from the 1890s. So he was interested in that and used those techniques to incorporate them into Ukrainian art. But there he created, this is very typical. This was on, I believe, the 5th floor of Hrushevsky's house. This burned down, but he had created a real kind of arts and crafts little apartment for himself with a lot of antiques. The book, by the way, was published by Ulan, by Pavlovsky. It really is one of the classics discussing the work of Kryczewski. There he is. This is the hall, the lecture hall of the history section at VUAN. This is how it was designed. At the American Academy of Sciences. These are some of his designs. And then even there was an artist, Samo Kish, who had really made his career in still painting under Russian imperial rule, horses and battle scenes. Even he, at the age of 68, came up from Crimea to design a special carousel for Literaturny Yarmarok in the style, I guess, of Cossacks. So here we have another sort of Art Deco, Art Nouveau by some the artists, some more artwork of the generation that was nurtured by the Boychukis. A very interesting illustrator that later made a huge career designing propaganda posters for Stalin up in Moscow, and just drawings and humorous writing. We have some portraits by Petritsky, and I suppose a classic, probably the best portrait of them all, Vasil Semenko, the head of the leader of the Futurists, sitting in Cafe Pok in Kharkiv. Of course, it all ended very badly. The final scene is Khvelyovey's funeral. You see between Mykitenko, Johansen, some people have been scratched up. This is an old photograph where that it is actually taken from Khvelyovey's suicide, which is more what we heard about Budynok Slovo. But despite the looming political repressions, there was still much reason for optimism in the Ukrainian capital in 1929. Kharkiv was being transformed into metropolis, the huge constructivist straight industry complex, the Shprom was completed in the main square, tram lines were expanded throughout the city, many new structures, such as the housing complex Slovo, were on the verge of completion. Ukraine's artists were beginning to gain recognition abroad despite severe limitations on independent travel, and its art schools were attracting teachers from abroad. However, the most important message signaled by the visual language of Literaturny Yarmarok was that a consolidation was taking place, and something resembling a multi-layered, multifaceted, yet cohesive cultural elite, buttressed by institutional support, was coming into being. Not only was this seen as the appearance of national minorities, most specifically the Jewish, as an integral part of that cultural process, but also in the movement from a thin layer of Ukrainophile intellectuals downward into the world of popular culture and entertainment. The younger Literaturny Yarmarok illustrators were making their mark in the popular magazine Universalny Journal, and even more importantly, in January 1929, control of the magazine's editorial board passed into the hands of Bajan, Johansen, Smolich, Vishnya, and others. The generation of revolutionary Ukrainian artists were able to pull off a remarkable achievement by creating a completely modern cultural nexus, by appropriating the Soviet Ukrainian identity and creating a more attractive alternative to the cultural product offered by Russia by virtue of its inherent post-colonial dimension. It was not a given that they would have achieved this in Kyiv, and I see that it is time to complete. Will Kharkiv ever come to play that role in Ukrainian culture again? Will we have an equivalent of Khvelyovey, Johansen, Kulish, Kurbas, Semenko, Yermilov at the same place, at the same time to create such unique synergy? Life was difficult for them then. They were poor and hounded by police surveillance. All were personally heavily traumatized by 7 years of brutal war. And they were starting their quest when the country lay in ruins. This is not unlike some of the scenes we have been witnessing over the past summer. And I think it speaks to the potential of Kharkiv to be reborn again. Not Kharkiv, Eastern Ukraine. Kharkiv is still fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, our three presenters, of very, very rich material. We have very little time left, about 25 minutes, I believe. So, no, longer. Yeah, I think we have to ignore that time there. I will open the floor to discussion, on to questions. Please step up. We see already one. Introduce yourself, please, and do get in line.
My name is Yuri Shevchuk. I teach Ukrainian here at Columbia. And my question is to all of the presenters. How would you explain something that the kind of a paradox when you compare that period and Kharkiv as a representation of this incredible revival of Ukrainian culture in all its declensions, language, literature, arts, cinema. Within the period of time, which is what, 6 years only, the incredible assertiveness of that generation of Ukrainians, their capacity to create an incredibly attractive new identity, which is almost painfully urban, modern, winning over. I stood next to that Slovo building reading the names of all these people who used to live there, Polish names, Jewish names, Meller, Swedish. Everybody wanted to be Ukrainian at that time. Being Ukrainian was being with it. On the contrary, today, we see the project of Ukrainianness, what Shevelyov wrote as the fifth Kharkiv that Ukraine needs to create, the transcendence of the legacy of the empire, in shambles, in ruins. Ukrainians apologizing to everybody who wants to listen for being Ukrainian, for insisting on speaking their own language. When was the last time a French would apologize for that, or an American? Ukrainians apologizing for insisting on having their own national cinema, literature, Ukrainian literature being marginalized on its own territory, on and on and on. You know what I'm talking about. Would you explain why such stark result, or final result of this? And why is it that Russian culture, imperial culture, can only compete with Ukrainian culture after it destroys it, after it shuts it up, physically annihilates it, and then
drains it. Please, would you care to answer? I think the question was addressed to all three of you, so all three of you are welcome.
So let's go in order. I would say government cultural policy. This was all financed by the government with no questions asked. And I mean, that's a large part of it. That was a large part of it, of course. So it's a government, despite the fact that people were terrorized, everybody was spied on, people were repressed. Nonetheless, there was enough momentum, and there were enough people in power pushing. And in fact, you know, someone like Willové and of his whole group who were actually pushing this agenda. Sorry.
When you were talking, I recalled immediately what Yushchenko said when he came to power, when he became president of Ukraine. He said, to be Ukrainian is fashionable now. In Kharkiv, it was incredibly fashionable after 1923 to speak Ukrainian. And I don't remember the name, but someone among those who lived later in Budynek Slova, this person said, listen, how nice to have this feeling. It's fashionable after 1923 to speak Ukrainian. We would never have had this before, and probably it's going to be a very short period. And that's what happened. Probably fashion first. Second, it was allowed. After many, many years, and this inspired these people who wanted to write, they wanted to create, they wanted to be writers, they wanted to be poets, and I think it was just incredibly important for them. And precisely, probably after 1923, with this, probably, you're right, very short period, their identity had been born. But other than this, it's very difficult to explain why. It's just a very provocative question, but yeah, I think it's probably very difficult also to explain why this Renaissance occurred in the 1960s, and scholars are still trying to explain this phenomenon. What happened in the 1960s? Perhaps something was allowed also during this period of time. Thank you.
We could ask what happened, why did the Orange Revolution occur? I mean, perhaps we should go back to what Michael brought up last night, very briefly. You mentioned something that Shevelov believed in, some sort of telluric forces. Perhaps we should glance at that idea of Shevelov's and think about it. Any other questions?
Well, I think repression is easier to explain. We know a bit more about how you repress. I mean, this has been studied, and Olga is very good in her works on this. It's easy to cripple people, creative people. Creativity is harder to explain. How, you know, it seems to me anyway. How do you get this creative elan? What is it that makes people? What is it that inspires people? And it is some kind of mysterious faith in what they're doing, enthusiasm for what they're doing. So I detect that in the works of the 1920s. I also am pushing against this idea that just because they identified with proletarian culture, this was bad. I think if you look carefully and analyze carefully the films, for example, of Vertov, they're brilliant in many ways. I mean, he was a believer in the proletarian side of things, but he was a contributor to Ukrainian culture, to that aspect of what was going on in the 1920s. My feeling also is that, the reason why I got interested in this was, first of all, what I've spoken about, these different enthusiasms, is first of all, I've been looking at the films that have now been redigitalized, reproduced. These films are remarkable. There's a remarkable film industry that produced great things in the 20s and early 30s. And that's begun to work on me, changing my attitudes. The other thing is I've just written a book on Ukrainian nationalism in the 1930s and 40s. And much of the inspiration, it reminds me of what was going on here in Kharkiv. The kind of, even the belief in the state, even the belief in the strong man, these kinds of formal experiments too were echoed in Ukrainian nationalism in the 1930s. And I agree with Halyna that this is a kind of modernism. It's a reactionary modernism in the 1930s outside Ukraine, but it is modernism. And by not dealing with that form of modernism, I think we're missing something very fundamental and very important. And I write about this in my latest book. There are also other scholars who are now talking about modernism. Modernism of fascist modernism, if you like. Fascist modernism in Italy, in Germany, it was modernism. The autobahns, the buildings that were produced, and some of the literature can be seen as modernism. Marko Pavlichin would disagree probably, but I think this is it. This is the case. So I'm not sure that answers your question totally. I'm not sure where creativity comes from. I think we probably would agree much more. We would agree sooner on where repression comes from and how you can repress a culture. It's that much easier to do.
Just, if I may, one brief comment again about your question. You're a scholar of film studies, right? And I think you remember what I think the Serbian film director, very famous, said, Miro Kusturica. He said, slavery is easy, freedom is always difficult. And I believe this was the period when for them, for people who wanted to create, freedom was easy, it was allowed. So.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Just in the way of a comment.
Introduce yourself, please.
Olga Bertelsen from Philadelphia.
To see what was happening in Kharkiv, you don't need a time machine. You just need to go downtown at the Ukrainian Museum. You see works by some of the authors that were mentioned, like Petritsky and Meller. So this is something which we can experience directly.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, my name is Robert Stepanek. I'm a scholar, independent scholar, and I just wanted to address the. That's better. Address the question regarding why any kind of creativity flourished. There's actually a remarkably insightful piece of all surprising places, the Jordan Center at NYU website. It's a blog. It's surprising considering some of the opinions that emerged from there. But this particular blogger is writing about how Russia is engaged in a very narcissistic enterprise. It is a bully which casts itself as a victim. And historically, for hundreds of years, they have invaded other people's lands, not merely the former SSRs, but Chuvashia, Bashkortostan, Mariel, etc. And these are people who have not been allowed self-determination in their own homelands, made second-class citizens there, yet at the same time, it's arrogated as the motherland. And I would propose that that mentality, that narcissism, that insecurity, which is at the root of the Russian identity, needs to suppress other cultures and only will allow the expression of something that might be perceived as a competitive culture when it feels there's nothing to fear there. And conversely, when they do feel there's something to fear, it's those persons from these other cultures, whether it was Stalin, a Georgian, or today Ramzan Kadyrov, a Chechen, who demonstrate a capacity to be bloodthirsty in excess of what the Russians themselves are capable of. That it's only then that they respect competing cultures. And of course, obviously, the willingness to be that bloodthirsty, even if you are of a neighboring culture, in the name of Russia itself. I just wanted to throw that out. And
Thank you very much. Thank you. Other questions? I'm sure there must be questions. We still have some time, so I urge you to ask. I know there are several people here who are active speakers and questioners.
Okay, my name is Taras Kaznersky. Not so much a question as a footnote to Myroslav's presentation of those waves of enthusiasm. It's interesting to see how the initial avant-garde movement usually begins with destruction and pure creation, so destruction of mimesis, destruction of representation of reality, representational kind of art, thinking about suprematism or constructivism. But then the second wave comes and it becomes more utilitarian. After Litatlin, you end up with something like a teapot done by Malevich. However, you drink tea from that thing. Or, say Malevich designing a ticket for, Congress of Village Council. So there is that movement from absolute creation, from this absolute elan of new into let's now turn it into objects that will be used in the utilitarian aspect of it. And I think it's also philosophically what these waves, the proletarianism, could also be linked with some 1920s theorizing, especially Bogdanov came to mind with his notion of labor and art that must fuse. Labor, and especially labor at its highest, creation, that is labor which is, he would say, this is neurophysiological process, but it's also collective economical process, now is destined to become art, and vice versa. Art is labor, and it has to, so these two aspects have to embrace, and that's the play with proletarianism. It's interesting, though, how very quickly the actual sort of Stalinist art banishes and abandons those experiments, and after a short period of eclecticism, embraces the most triumphalist, the most narrative, the most didactic models of the 19th century. And I'm sure you're dealing with these aspects as you progress.
Thank you, Taras. Anyone else? Well, no one else, so you may. Yes, I think so. Would you like to comment?
Well, I do actually agree with very much with what Taras Koznarsky says. And it's always puzzled me how the most individualistic and the most nonconformist individuals, like Semenkov, for example, within a few years become the most conformist, you know, the most, the biggest contributors to this idea of a monolith. It's not, there is a change to utilitarianism and so on. There is a change to a glorification of technique. But something goes wrong with the people themselves. Instead of continuing on exploring, they become people who simply become followers of the rules. I'm not sure why that happens. I've always wondered about that myself. Whether it is something about these avant-gardists. Well, some people have written about the avant-garde. It can only exist in liberal societies. It can only exist in societies where there's freedom for an artist to experiment and explore. You can't be a nonconformist when the society changes. So ironically, the avant-gardists who are destroying bourgeois society, who are destroying liberal society, are destroying the ground on which they themselves, the ground that allows them to be creative. And every individual made choices. Those choices were different for everybody. And the avant-garde in particular, I think, some of them made their peace with the regime and simply became followers, became propagandists, or else killed themselves or were put away. It's a mystery to me what goes on in the minds of avant-gardists in that way, and I'm not quite sure.
Alcoholics, most of them. It's true.
I think you need a realm of freedom. If you don't have that realm of freedom in the state, there's nothing for you to do.
Ale? Sorry.
So
That's okay, I think we have,
If I could just follow up, because I was going to speak on this. I think what we have here is actually something that has been discussed, even though discussed without the controversial implications by people like Boris Groys, for example, since Anvayu was mentioned in his old book, Gesamtkunstwerk Stalin, the idea that totalitarian state usurps the creative urge, and then the dictator becomes the quote-unquote author. And what people have often argued is that revolutionary avant-garde artists confuse their project of changing art with the new Soviet society's attempt to change daily life. And the utilitarianism actually comes very interestingly there too, because it's the collapse of pragmatic and art as an intellectual environment. And here I'm thinking of another scholar who's written very well about it, Christina Keir, who's now at Northwestern, her book, Imagine No Possessions, which specifically talks about how all these avant-garde artists in the 1920s started producing clothes design or new forms of, dinnerware and so on and so forth. But the problem that Myroslav has addressed here, how do people self-rationalize continuing with those societies? How do you go on? Is really challenging, but it's because it happened step by step. It's almost like that parable that says is that, if you slowly raise the temperature of a pot in which a frog is sitting, the frog will not jump out and will end up getting cooked. Whereas if you drop a frog into boiling water, it will of course jump right back out and remain alive. So it's because it was very, very, very gradual, and people were self-rationalizing their necessity to survive. And then you have even sort of great oppositional figures, think Осип Мандельштам was mentioned earlier, sort of writing things like, но как колхоз идет единоличник, я в мир вхожу, и люди хороши. So if he wants to convince himself of this sort of triumphalism of Soviet life, a person who is of a completely different dimension, a completely different set of rules, that is one of the examples. And then what happens is the path sets, if the repressive apparatus, the act of resistance becomes not possible, then you drop out, like Svidzinsky. Sort of, you continue, but you basically go into internal immigration. So, I mean, Svidzinsky's end also was tragic, but for a while he was able to continue and sort of remain true to himself, to his creativity.
Yeah, I think if I could just very briefly, I think you're onto something there. My problem is how do you, as you say, how do these people convince themselves? You know, because you have to you go from being a nonconformist to a conformist. What goes on in your brain? And I suggest maybe that these you can substitute one enthusiasm for another, very very gradually, or through time. And you can sort of, a person thinks they're enthusiastic about one thing, but they're actually, the enthusiasm has shifted to a different stage. And you end up enthusiasm for national cultural revolution, enthusiasm for the worker, enthusiasm for the state. And somewhere this happens without a person even being fully aware of it. And I think the state was clever in that respect. Stalin was clever in that respect. So maybe that's a partial explanation of what's going on.
Thank you. I believe we have to end, and our last questioner has relinquished his position. So let me conclude this session. As I always like to end with Yuri Volodymyrovich Shchevelov, so just one sentence, namely, especially relating to the previous discussion, he writes in his memoirs that the reason that he wants to be with the underdog is also because they are on the rise. Uvstavanyi, I forget what the term he uses, but they're on the rising, they're rising, there is something productive and energetic behind it. So thank you very much, all of you, and